our number 10 spot, we have this bullet story. This story comes from a person who is working in trauma surgery. One night they got a notification that a man had been shot 3 times in the head and was on the way in. When he gets there, he has literally one eye hanging out of its socket, blood everywhere, and he is slumped over. So it seemed that he had one bullet go in through his temple and out of his right eye socket, one bullet in the nose exited out of the roof of his mouth, and another went in his cheek and out the side of his head. The doctor goes over to examine him and is assuming he'll just be pronouncing him dead, but when he tilts the man's head back, he quickly says, "Yo, be gentle." The doctor accidentally screamed, but he was not alone, as everyone in the room was quickly shocked at the fact that this man was still alive. I guess the entry and exit wounds showed that every single bullet had missed his brain, and he ended up making it through the whole ordeal. In our number 9 spot today, we have this eyeless face story. Before I get into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. This one comes from a nurse rather than a doctor, but I feel like it definitely still applies. She was working at the home of an elderly lady who had some learning disabilities and had also had her eyes completely removed due to a condition that she had from birth. The lady was apparently super nice, but had this habit of wandering around her apartment late at night in complete silence. One night the nurse woke up and left her room at 2 a.m. to head to the bathroom when she had quite the scare. As she left her bedroom, she was met with the old lady who was silently standing in the hall as she turned her eyeless face towards the nurse. Imagine being in a dark room after you just woke up and seeing an eyeless face look at you. It honestly would be enough to frighten anyone before you realized exactly what was going on. In our number 8 spot today, we have another eye story. This story comes from someone who goes by the screen name I'm Cuttin, and they said, "I have quite a few stories. Most of them are hilarious, and then there are those you never want to think about. What messed me up the most was when I saw how eyes change at the moment of death. Imagine you are looking at clear water, but that clear water changes to foggy in an instant. In my 8 years here, I've only seen this once, and I've personally seen well over 250 dead or dying people." This is one thing that I've always thought that I can't understand how healthcare professionals do. I definitely don't think I can see people die all the time, especially not when it's like what he just described. In our number 7 spot today, we have a car accident story. This story comes from a person called Jeremy Howell, and they're recounting one of their mom's stories. Jeremy says, "A guy came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, 'Don't let me go back there. Please, please, please don't let me go back.' A few seconds later, they lost him." What? Like, imagine. That would scare me half to death. Seriously, you guys. In our number 6 spot today, we have this dead guy moaning story. This story comes from someone who goes by the username I'll Do It Later from when they worked at a hospital. They said, "One of my duties was to help wheel patients who had expired down to the in-house morgue. Once we were wheeling an older man from the ER down the hallway when he let out this low moan. I started to panic thinking that he was coming back to life, but the registered nurse explained to me, in brackets they have newbie, that sometimes the air in the lungs doesn't come out until sometime later, or it is delayed for a bit." While I definitely feel like whoever this story is from should have definitely already known this, that would be so scary for a second when you don't know what is happening. In our number 5 spot today, we have a crying blood story. This is another story that comes from a registered nurse, but it definitely needed to be mentioned in this video. A 24-year-old man came into the ER one day with flu-like symptoms. He had some sort of rash that sadly ended up being a symptom of failing a battle with bacterial meningitis, and it was causing him to bleed internally. He was in such bad condition that he started crying, but his tears were blood. She said she could see how scared he was at his eyes, which is so sad to think about. He ended up actually passing away, and the nurse whose story this is had said that in her long nursing career, this is the one that just really stuck with her. In our number 4 spot today, we have a whole story. This story comes from someone called Pete Lancosta and is a bit of a gross one, so just a warning. Pete says it was someone who had a massive hole under his right arm, creating a cavity where you could see and hear whistling from the right lung. long. It had been worsening for maybe 10 years, so the initial injury had mostly healed. Honestly, you guys, I almost couldn't read this one out loud. I can't imagine what that would be like for all parties involved in that situation. In our number 3 spot today, we have a tumor story. This story actually ended up being published in a medical journal for how crazy it is. A 90-pound, 16-year-old girl came in one day with flu-like symptoms, a sore right side with a bit of a bump. They went to check for gallstones, but it actually turned out to be a tumor. It ended up being removed the next week, and it turned out to be a 7-pound tumor that was as big as a dinner plate. This is not normal. It was so big that it had outgrown its blood supply. That's insane and so yucky. I'm glad this one came out with such a positive outcome though. We needed more of that on this list today. In our number 2 spot today, we have this intestine story. This story starts off on a wild note from someone who is explaining one of their mom's stories. It goes, apparently one guy walked into the emergency room entrance holding his intestines in his hand, calm as can be, and shouted, "Can I get a little help, please? I think I'm gonna die." Now, this dude wasn't gutted wide open holding all of his entrails, but he had a pretty major cut to the midsection, causing some of his intestines to be protruding externally. This dude is alive, and my mom told me she had no idea how somebody could walk into an emergency room like that and be so calm. Honestly, props to everyone in this situation for remaining calm, because it undoubtedly saved that guy's life that day. In our number 1 spot today, you guys, we have this rising from the dead story. This story comes from someone who goes by Simple Simon 6262 and is honestly pretty crazy, but also kind of cool. They said, "When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye, but by that time, the family had left. She had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Suddenly, she sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get the monitors and equipment back on her. They started working on her again, she stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and then promptly died a second time." That would be so insane to witness, but I'm also so glad that she got to say goodbye to her family. I honestly think that must be the reason she ended up coming back, even if it was just for a couple minutes. Starting off this list at number 10. This story starts off with a man who has had quite a few too many alcoholic beverages walking into the emergency department. This usually is not a great combination for the start of a story, and this one is no different. After waiting in the waiting room for a while, he eventually gets taken into a room to see the doctor. When the doctor asks him what's wrong, the man explains that he can't get his contacts out. He said that he was trying to pull them out of his eyes, but he just couldn't get them out, and it was starting to be painful for him. The doctor goes to examine his eyes and to see if he can figure out what's going on. When the doctor looks at the man's eyes, he realizes that most likely because of the alcohol, this man doesn't realize that he must have already taken them out, and that he has actually been pulling on his eye and not his contacts. The man ended up having a partial tear in his cornea, and I am so glad that it wasn't worse, because this story really gives me a shiver down my spine. Moving on to number 9. Motorcycle crashes are pretty notorious for having some gruesome scenes, and this one definitely was no different. A man was brought into the ER after being involved in a crash when he was driving his motorcycle, and he had a severe foot and leg injury. The doctor didn't know exactly how bad, but once he gets there, the doctor goes to examine the damage and decide what the next course of action should be. As he's examining the foot, he realizes that it is barely hanging on by a thread. It was so bad, he described it like a mozzarella stick that had been pulled apart. The doctor, of course, realizes how serious this situation is and of course gets this man into the operating room as fast as possible. Luckily, the doctor was actually able to save this man's foot and completely reattach it, which is amazing news. Moving on to number 8. This one is a pretty short story, as this doctor didn't include a lot of detail, but it sure is disgusting. This doctor went to see a patient who apparently had an ingrown toenail, which honestly seems pretty painful. When the doctor gets there, he realizes that this ingrown toenail is actually just a toenail that is barely hanging on at all, and that the best solution at this point really would just be to remove it entirely. The doctor gets the toe frozen and pulls the nail off, but what he reveals underneath is what he never expected. There were actually actual maggots living under this toenail, and apparently not just a few. This definitely shocked the doctor, as it was the last thing he was expecting to see, so it's no wonder this experience really stuck with him. Moving on to number 7. This story is told from the patient, but definitely shocked the doctors who were there that day. A 10-year-old girl noticed a bump on her tongue one day, but didn't think too much of it. The next day, however, the bump had really grown and it was freaking her out, so she told her mom, which is the right thing to do. Her mom took her to the emergency room, where they waited for a long time, because that's what you do at the emergency room, before they were finally taken into a room to see the doctor. The doctor comes and the girl is waiting to hear why she has a bump on her tongue when the doctor says, "I've never seen this before." Her mom is in the corner crying out of worry, and this 10-year-old girl thinks doctors know everything, so she's obviously freaked out that he doesn't know what's going on. 5 more doctors and the chief of staff came to take a look at this bump, and they decided that the best course of action was to poke it. They applied a local anesthetic so that it wouldn't hurt, but she could feel the pressure as they poked around. The doctor then asked, "When was the last time you ate popcorn?" The 10-year-old replied, "A few days ago," as she could clearly remember, since she was trying not to chew it loudly while she was watching the X-Files Sewer Monster episode. As it turns out, a popcorn kernel had suctioned itself to her tongue, and since the tissue on your tongue regenerates so quickly, the kernel was basically just absorbed into her tongue, which is what was giving it a bump. Definitely a pretty crazy story that I am glad had such a simple solution and ending. Moving on to number 6. This story comes from the Reddit user Cow, and is a story they got from their neighbor. This neighbor was working in the ER one day and described it as one of those days that is just bloody. She explained that there was an unbelievable amount of really bad nosebleeds that day for some reason, and she was constantly dealing with people who were getting woozy from their nosebleeds. A guy walks into the ER, and as she turns around, she sees him holding a bloody rag to his face. She's thinking to herself, "Really? Another nosebleed?" She asks the man to lower the rag so that she can see how bad it is, and he listens. When he lowers the rag, though, she sees that his jaw literally drops, like almost completely off of his face except for a few tendrils of skin that were holding it on. She calmly asks the man to put his rag back on his face, which he does, and then she quickly escorted him to the trauma center so that he could get the help that he needed. I do not know how our healthcare professionals stay so calm in these kinds of situations, because I would absolutely panic. Moving on to number 5. This is a story that comes from a studying doctor's professor, and it takes place in rural Alabama. A couple came into the emergency room after they had been quite intoxicated and ended up getting in a huge argument. During the argument, the woman in this couple accidentally fell off of their porch and into some shrubs. Of course, the argument immediately stopped and the man rushed over to see if she was okay. She was basically fine, aside from a few scratches, but he noticed that it seemed like during her fall, something had gotten stuck in her arm. Since they had that liquid courage, plus I'm sure the worry about the cost of medical care, the man decided to get some pliers and just remove the object himself. He clamped down and pulled as hard as he could, but it just absolutely would not budge. He eventually gave up and they headed to the emergency room where the professor was working. He examines the woman and he very quickly realizes that she had a compound fracture of her humerus, and what the man was trying to pull out of her arm was actually her bone. I hate that one. Moving on to number 4. This story comes from Lado Telly on Reddit and is a story from when their mom was earlier on in her medical training. A man came into the ER with some foot issues, so she began to do a foot exam. Upon first examination, his feet were extremely gangrenous, which is usually what happens to a limb when the tissue starts to decay as there's insufficient blood flow. She quickly knew that there was a slew of issues she was about to need to take care of on his feet, and decided that the best first step would be to soak his feet before dressing them. She prepared a basin of warm water and placed his feet in there to soak, and while they are soaking, she heads off to get some other work done. About 30 minutes later, she returns to the room since the feet have probably soaked for long enough. As she goes to remove his feet from the water, she realizes that all 10 of his toes had come off in the water and were floating. So gross. This story is another one from Lado Telly on Reddit, as both of his parents were doctors. So this one comes from his father and is based in Scotland in the early 90s. Apparently it was a very sunny day for Scotland, and one of the only days you would actually be able to get a tan. One Scottish man got a little too excited about the nice weather, and rather than getting slathered in sunscreen, he grabbed some sheets of tinfoil and covered himself in cooking oil. This is definitely not what anyone should do at any point, but unfortunately this man maybe didn't know any better. A few hours later, he had to be picked up in an ambulance and taken to the emergency department, which is where Lad O'Telly's Dr. Dad comes in. This man had burned himself so badly in the sun that he had third-degree burns all over his body. Moving on to number 2. This story comes from Sideshow87 on Reddit, as they're explaining one of their father's stories, as he was an emergency room doctor for 20 years. Just to make the story more clear, this user refers to his father as Dr. J. A patient came into the ER one night holding his stomach, and the front of his jacket was bloody. Dr. J could tell that he was really out of it, and he also seemed to be under the influence. Dr. J asked what was going on and if he could explain the issue, and the patient responded that his stomach was hurting him. Dr. J says, "Let's take a look," and goes to pull the guy's jacket and arms back so that he can examine the stomach when things take quite a turn. As the guy pulls his arms away, his intestines literally start to spill out on the floor, which really explains why his stomach was hurting so bad. The patient apparently very matter-of-factly explained how he sustained these injuries and how he realized he probably needed to go to the hospital. I'm sure this was definitely one of the more shocking days on the job for Dr. J. Moving on to number 1. This story comes from someone who's recounting their dad's story, as he is a doctor who we'll call Dr. K. Dr. K was off duty one day and went to pick up some pizzas for his family. As he was just turning onto the street the pizza place was on, he heard a very loud crashing sound. He turned around and realized that a motorcycle had just slammed into the side of an SUV. His face ended up taking a lot of the impact, so his helmet flew all the way off of his head and about 30 feet into the air. Dr. K rushed over to help and saw that this man was in very bad shape and was struggling to breathe, but Dr. K did everything he could to clear his airway and then made sure his neck was stabilized until the ambulance arrived. The ambulance took 10 whole minutes, so it is definitely a very good thing that Dr. K was there while they waited. Once the ambulance got there, Dr. K told them what he knew, and off they went. It turns out this man ended up suffering multiple fractures in a couple different vertebrae, an almost non-existent jaw, and other facial fractures, broken collarbones, broken ribs, collapsed lung, amongst a slew of other things. Flash forward 1 full year and Dr. K is working in the emergency room where he has worked for the last 20 years, and he gets a page to come to the main lobby of the hospital. When he gets to the lobby, he sees a man standing there that looks kind of familiar, but he doesn't really know him. This man comes up to Dr. K and wraps him up in a great big bear hug and starts crying. That is when Dr. K realizes who this man is and of course starts crying as well. The man just keeps repeating, "Thank you, you saved my life." They chatted for a while about the recovery process and how his physiotherapy was going. Apparently Dr. K has said it was one of the best experiences of his life. Oh, that was so nice. I just liked the ending of that one, which is why I had to put it at number 1, because it just really leaves you with that warm, fuzzy feeling.
Starting us off at number 10 is Hannah. This story kind of got me upset. I don't know why. Like, Amy, you know that anxious feeling in your stomach and like you just feel a bit sad? That's what it made me feel like. So this one was shared by a Reddit user called RKelM, who worked at the hospital. They said there was one day where a little boy was brought in an ambulance. He had had the common cold, then his parents had tucked him into bed real warm, but it started getting worse. The toddler started going in and out of consciousness, and despite trying their best doing a rapid intubation, the boy ended up passing away a few days later. But before he did, anytime his parents weren't at the hospital, he kept talking to the user about his baby sister Hannah. And this hit way too close to home for the user, who had a son similar in age to him and a daughter called Hannah. Either way, the boy dies and 2 years go by and the same family comes in with their sick daughter, and the daughter was called Hannah, which was weird. When the boy mentioned her, the user assumed she was at home alive and well, but she hadn't even been birthed or conceived yet. How did he know he was gonna have a baby sister called Hannah? Coming in at number 9 are the burns. So this one is genuinely one of the most screwed up stories I've ever read about, and believe me, I've read a lot of stories for this channel. Shared by Reddit user My Dog Operates Better Than You, which let's appreciate that for a second. Now, so this user was doing his rotation in a burn unit when this occurred. A pimp in the city decided to light one of his prostitutes on fire, and as a last resort, she bear hugged him. As you can imagine, both of them suffered pretty severe injuries, especially her since she also had inhalation burns. They were both being treated in the same ICU but on opposite ends of the hospital, understandably so. A few weeks go by and eventually the woman succumbs to her injuries and passes away. Not even 30 minutes after she dies, the pimp starts screaming on the other side of the hospital saying, "Get her out, get the goddamn bitch out of my room." This dude was seeing her ghost in his room and freaking the hell out. Honestly, if I was her and I died because of him lighting me on fire, I would haunt him till the day he dies. No cap. Don't give a shit. At number 8, we have pediatrics. Pediatricians must have so much patience since they're the ones dealing with your baby until they're 18. They're dealing with every new parent calling them 50 times at night because their baby burped and they thought it was choking. This one was shared by a pediatrician on Reddit that goes by the username AGF0605, and there was a rumor at his hospital that the 4th floor next to the oncology unit was haunted. Now, the user usually didn't do night shifts, but that night they had picked one up and was working in the NICU, which was also on the 4th floor. Basically, if you don't know what the NICU is, it's where they take neonatal babies, either some who have been born prematurely or born with a few issues, so they just stay in the NICU. In case you didn't know that. Now at about 3 a.m. the user was ready to take their break, so they took a shortcut through the oncology unit. But when they went through the double doors, they saw this child skipping merrily down the hall. And as a doctor, the user thought the kid had left his room, so he called out to him, but just as he did, the kid turned around and disappeared into thin air. Funnily enough, a lot of other doctors and nurses had seen that same kid in that same hallway. So I'm guessing this kid passed away at the hospital and his spirit is just roaming around, skipping merrily along. Filling at number 7 slot, our bedtime story. So Reddit user Bratipilla's mum used to work at the burn unit at this hospital in Dallas. She would work the night shifts and would always get asked whether the burn unit was haunted or not, and honestly, she didn't really have an answer. One night, a little girl came in with severe burns, and naturally her parents couldn't stay with her every single night at the hospital, so the user's mum would check up on her a lot, you know, just to make sure she was okay and stuff. Either way, one night the user's mum asked the girl if she ever got scared, and she said, "No, I don't get scared because an old woman comes to read to me every single night and sits beside my bed while I fall asleep." That's honestly super heartwarming, except for the fact there was no older women employees working that night, and the mum was usually the only one on duty. So whose grandma died and kept this girl from feeling scared? Because that's very cute. We stand. Now at number 6 is The Medium. This one's super interesting and was shared by Reddit user SmackMax, who worked at a psych ward. Now at this ward there was this one patient that said she had psychic abilities, and the user wasn't really a believer but just humored the patient anyway. She would do readings for the staff and have a bit of a laugh, and because of her recent stroke she had trouble walking on her own. One night she pressed on her call buzzer and a nurse came in to check on her. The woman told her she should check on the patient in the side room since he was now dead. Keep in mind this woman cannot move, so it's not like she could have gone in there and checked herself. The doctor and nurse went into the side room to find the patient very much dead. As they prepared the body bag and everything, the duo asked the patient how she knew he had died, and she said she saw him coming out of his room looking very distressed, and then she realized she must be seeing his ghost. She then apparently went ghost whisperer on him and explained to him what was going on and how he could pass over to the light. You bet your ass the user became a believer after that. Coming in at number 5 is Hysteria. This one is a doozy. I feel like if I was the patient in this story, I would have literally thought I was in actual hell. So this one was shared by Redditor I would rather not say one, who shared this story on behalf of her friend who is a doctor. One day a woman was brought in and she was already unconscious when she came inside. But as soon as she was put in her room, she woke up absolutely hysterical, crying non-stop, thrashing around, begging to be taken out of the hospital, and so the doctor finally listened to her and took her outside. The second the woman crossed the exit door, she was completely calm. After a while, she explained how she can see the dead and they know she can see them, so they had all surrounded her bed inside the hospital and were just shouting at her, asking for her help. Damn, can you imagine that? I couldn't be able to handle that. I wouldn't be able to handle that. I couldn't be able to handle that. What's English? At number 4 is The Comeback. This one was shared on Reddit 5 months ago by user Easy Growth, who works at a hospital. One of her patients was this card reader who was very well liked in Louisiana, and she was damn accurate too. Anyway, the user had been caring for her for a few days, but that specific day she had been extra lethargic. Thinking she should check on her, the user went in to find her completely unresponsive, with her daughter trying frantically to wake her up. The user tries a sternal rub, but no response. Just as she calls was a rapid response, the woman wakes back up bursting with energy within 30 seconds, which is not natural. She shared that she had just died and was watching the two girls in the room the whole time and knew everything that had just happened. Apparently God told her it wasn't time to die yet, so she woke up and a few days later was actually discharged. She's still alive in her 80s now, still doing card readings. Can you imagine? Filling at number 3 slot is the neurosurgeon. So this one was shared by Quasi_Modo on Reddit, who had a 6-year-old who fell after climbing a tree. Why do we love climbing trees as kids? What is it? It's just so fun, we can't help it. Anyway, the user rushed her daughter to the hospital where she stayed unresponsive. She wouldn't react to pain, voice, yet it seemed like she was talking to someone. The neurosurgeon heard the little girl say, well, I don't know, but I don't want to be dead, before becoming unresponsive again. Like, was she talking to God? Thankfully, the surgeon got her in the operating room in time and she survived. Funnily enough, she doesn't remember saying that at all. Dude, she literally was dead and was talking to God about not wanting to die. It's crazy. Now, number 2 is the disappearance. I have no explanations for this one whatsoever, so if any of you do, please comment away and let me know. Shared by Redditor Dumbledore, who works at a hospital, they recounted the story of this one day where a patient had to get an x-ray done. He was taken to the room in a wheelchair and left there to get everything done. You know how it goes, and approximately 5 minutes later, a notification from the patient's room goes off, so obviously the user goes in to check on everything and make sure everything's good. As soon as he walks in, he realizes everything is gone. The bed was gone, the patient was gone, the windows were closed, so it's not like he went out that way. I mean, the guy couldn't walk on his own, so I don't think he's jumping out the window, period, let alone with a bed. The attending nurse also had no idea where the bed or patient went, literally clueless. They just replaced the bed and that was that. What the hell? And finally, at number 1 is Strapped Down. This one was such a hidden gem that I found on Reddit, but I'm glad I did because this story is the one where it's like, okay, I've had enough, good night, internet. Shared by Reddit user Circle_Stone, they said how their aunt is a nurse and how she experienced something horrific. I know she's not a doctor, but still, medical field. Allow it. Now at the hospital there was this one old lady that refused to sleep unless she was strapped down in her bed at night. Apparently there was a dark figure that she could see trying to grab her and drag her out of the room and kill her, so she had to be strapped to the bed. The aunt obliged and would routinely check in on her the next few nights, and anytime they walked in, it looked like someone was trying to pull her off the bed right in front of their eyes. The next night the user's aunt is off and a new nurse is working who does not strap down the old lady. When she went in to check on her an hour later, the old woman was dead on the floor by the door. Her hand was just stretched past the door into the hallway, just like she said she would die, which is just so utterly creepy, you guys.